That my father sold my collection without permission, what I found. In his attic changed everything. 3 years can change a lot in a person's life. For me, it had been enough time to establish a new life in Seattle, 2,000 miles from my childhood home in Ohio. I had a decent apartment overlooking Lake Union, a job at a tech company that paid well enough, and a small circle of friends who made the perpetual rain somewhat bearable. I had managed to put a comfortable distance between myself and my past, both physically and emotionally. That was until the phone rang on a dreary Tuesday evening in October. Daniel? The voice on the other end was instantly recognizable, even after all this time. My father, Robert Ashton, sounding older than I remembered. "Dad?" I replied, the word feeling foreign on my tongue. "Is everything okay?" There was a pause, filled only by the static of the line and the sound of rain beating against my window. "It's your mother," he finally said. "She's in the hospital. Heart attack." The world seemed to tilt slightly. Despite everything, despite the years of silence and the unspoken resentment, the news hit me like a physical blow. "Is she?" I couldn't finish the question. "She's stable for now. The doctors are saying she'll need surgery. But she's asking for you, Daniel." I closed my eyes, feeling the weight of obligation settling on my shoulders. Obligation and something else. Guilt, perhaps, for staying away for so long. For letting the rift between me and my father keep me from my mother as well. "I'll be there tomorrow," I said finally. After hanging up, I sat motionless on my couch, staring at the rain-streaked window without really seeing it. My thoughts drifted back to the last time I had been home, to the argument that had severed the already fragile relationship between my father and me. It had started with my collection, comic books mostly, but also vintage toys and memorabilia I'd been amassing since I was 10 years old. To my father, they were childish things that I should have outgrown. To me, they represented something more, something precious. They were artifacts of escapism, windows into worlds where heroes existed and justice prevailed, collected during a childhood where I often felt powerless and overlooked. When I left for college, I had carefully packed everything away in storage, boxes, storing them in my old bedroom closet with the understanding that they would remain untouched until I had space for them in my own home. But when I returned during my senior year break, I discovered that my father had sold everything. Every comic, every action figure, every piece of memorabilia, at a yard sale for a fraction of their worth. "You're too old for those things," he had said dismissively. "I didn't think you'd want them anymore." The fight that followed was explosive, fueled by years of simmering tensions and fundamentally different worldviews. My father, pragmatic to a fault, couldn't understand the value I placed on what he saw as mere children's entertainment. I couldn't forgive what felt like a profound betrayal of trust. I left the next day and hadn't returned since. Our communication had been limited to stilted phone calls on holidays, gradually tapering off to almost nothing. Now, 3 years later, I was being called back by circumstance. As I booked a red-eye flight to Columbus, I tried to prepare myself mentally for the return, for seeing my mother in a hospital bed, for facing my father again. Little did I know that this reluctant homecoming would lead me to a discovery that would change everything I thought I knew about my family, and about my father in particular. Chapter 2. Return to Oakwood. The flight to Columbus was turbulent, matching my unsettled state of mind. I hadn't slept, watching instead as the country passed beneath me in darkness, punctuated by the clustered lights of cities and towns. By the time we landed, a pale sun was rising over Ohio, casting long shadows across the tarmac. I rented a car at the airport, a nondescript sedan that smelled faintly of air freshener and cigarettes, and began the familiar drive to Oakwood, the suburb where I'd grown up. The town hadn't changed much in 3 years. The same storefronts, lined Main Street, the same traffic lights blinked at empty intersections. The same neat rows of houses with their manicured lawns stood in quiet solidarity. The hospital was a modern building on the outskirts of town, all glass and steel, incongruous against the backdrop of the small community it served. I found a parking spot near the entrance and sat for a moment, steeling myself. Then, taking a deep breath, I walked in. The antiseptic smell hit me immediately, that universal hospital scent of disinfectant and despair. At the reception desk, a woman with tired eyes directed me to the cardiac care unit on the third floor. My mother's room was at the end of a long corridor. When I reached the doorway, I paused, taking in the sight of her lying in the hospital bed, looking smaller and more fragile than I remembered. She was asleep, her gray-streaked hair fanned out on the pillow, an IV line snaking from her arm to a bag of clear fluid hanging beside the bed. And there, sitting in a chair by the window, was my father. He looked up as I entered, and for a moment, neither of us spoke. He had aged in the 3 years since I'd seen him last. His hair was now completely gray, the lines around his eyes and mouth deeper, his shoulders slightly stooped. He wore the same type of button-down shirt and khaki pants that had been his uniform for as long as I could remember, but they hung looser on his frame. "Daniel," he said finally, standing up. He moved as if to approach me, then stopped, uncertainty in his posture. "Dad," I replied with a nod, focusing my attention on my mother. "How is she?" "Better today. The doctors say the surgery is scheduled for tomorrow morning." He cleared his throat. "She'll be glad you came." I moved to the side of the bed, gently taking my mother's hand. Her skin felt papery and cool. "Has she been awake much?" "On and off. They've got her on some pretty strong medication." He hesitated. "Listen, Daniel, I appreciate you coming all this way." I didn't respond, unsure of what to say. The gulf between us felt both vast and trivial in the face of my mother's condition. After a moment of awkward silence, my father spoke again. "You must be tired from the flight. Why don't you go to the house, get some rest? I'll call if anything changes." The thought of staying in my childhood home without my mother there, just my father and me circling each other warily, was unappealing. But I was exhausted, and a hospital chair wasn't conducive to the sleep I desperately needed. "Yeah, okay," I agreed reluctantly. He handed me his set of house keys, our fingers briefly touching in the exchange. "Your room is how you left it," he said, and I wasn't sure if that was meant as a peace offering or simply a statement of fact. I leaned down to kiss my mother's forehead, whispering that I would be back soon, then turned to leave. At the door, I paused, looking back at my father, who had resumed his vigil by the window. "Dad," I said, the words still feeling strange. "Have you gotten any sleep?" He shrugged. "I'll be fine." I nodded, recognizing the stubborn self-sufficiency that I had inherited from him. "I'll bring you a change of clothes when I come back." The drive to my childhood home was a journey through memories. Every street corner, every storefront seemed to hold the ghost of some past experience. There was the park where I had learned to ride a bike, my father running alongside me, one hand steadying the seat until I found my balance. There was the ice cream shop where we used to go on summer evenings, the three of us sitting outside with cones that melted faster than we could eat them. These snippets of happier times made the rift that had developed later all the more painful. When I pulled into the driveway of the modest two-story colonial where I had grown up, I sat for a moment, taking in the familiar sight. The house needed paint, I noticed, and the front garden, once my mother's pride, looked somewhat neglected. Small signs of the passage of time, of things gradually falling into disrepair. Inside, the house smelled the same, a mixture of my mother's potpourri, old books, and the indefinable scent of home. I stood in the entryway, a wave of nostalgia washing over me. Family photos lined the hallway wall, chronicling my growth from a gap-toothed child to a solemn-faced graduate. I was surprised to see a recent photo of me that my mother must have taken from my social media. a reminder that despite the distance, she had been keeping track of my life. I made my way upstairs to my old bedroom, pushing open the door with a strange sense of trepidation. As my father had said, it was largely how I had left it. The same blue walls, the same desk where I had done my homework, the same twin bed with its faded Star Wars comforter. But it felt smaller somehow, like a museum exhibit of a life I had outgrown. The closet door was ajar, and I could see that it was empty except for a few old clothes and board games. The space where my collection had once been stored was vacant, a physical reminder of the betrayal that had driven me away. Exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed me, and I collapsed onto the bed, not bothering to remove my shoes. Despite the tumult of emotions, sleep claimed me almost immediately, pulling me into a deep, dreamless rest. When I woke, disoriented in the dim light, it took me a moment to remember where I was. The clock on the nightstand showed 6:30 p.m. I had slept for nearly 8 hours. Sitting up, I checked my phone and found a text from my father saying that there was no change in my mother's condition and that he would stay at the hospital overnight. I took a shower, washing away the staleness of travel, then put together a bag of clean clothes for my father. Before heading back to the hospital, I decided to make myself something to eat. The kitchen, like the rest of the house, was a time capsule. The same floral curtains hung over the sink, the same magnets cluttered the refrigerator, the same chipped mug that my father always used sat on the counter beside the coffee maker. As I made a simple sandwich, I noticed a stack of mail on the kitchen table, bills mostly, but also a letter from an insurance company addressed to my mother. I frowned, picking it up. The envelope had been opened, and I hesitated only briefly before pulling out the letter. It detailed a denied claim for a treatment related to a cardiac condition, a condition I hadn't known about until yesterday. How long had my mother been sick, and why hadn't anyone told me? A surge of anger rose within me, directed primarily at my father. Even with something this important, he had kept me in the dark, had waited until my mother was in a hospital bed before reaching out. It was typical of him, dealing with problems alone, sharing only on a need-to-know basis. I put the letter back, my appetite gone, and grabbed the bag of clothes. It was time to return to the hospital, to sit with my mother, and to have a long-overdue conversation with my father. Little did I know that this was just the beginning of the revelations that awaited me in my childhood home. Chapter 3. The Hospital Vigil. The hospital corridor was quieter at night, the overhead lights dimmed to a soft glow that did little to dispel the institutional atmosphere. When I reached my mother's room, I found my father exactly where I had left him, keeping watch from the chair by the window. He looked up as I entered, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. "I brought you some clothes," I said, placing the bag on an empty chair. "And there's a sandwich in there, too. You should eat something." He nodded, murmuring thanks. Then, gesturing toward the bed, he added, "She was awake for a while earlier, asking for you." I moved to my mother's side, taking her hand in mine. Her eyes fluttered open at my touch, focusing slowly on my face. "Daniel," she whispered, a small smile forming. "You came?" "Of course I did," I replied, squeezing her hand gently. "How are you feeling?" "Better now that you're here." Her voice was weak but clear. "Both my boys together again." I glanced at my father, who had moved to the other side of the bed. His face was carefully neutral, but I could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he was holding himself. "The doctor says the surgery tomorrow is straightforward," my mother continued. "Don't look so worried." "I found the insurance letter, Mom," I said, unable to keep the accusation from my voice. "How long has this been going on? Why didn't you—" "Tell me." She exchanged a look with my father, something unspoken passing between them. "It wasn't a big deal, honey. Just some tests, some medication." "Not a big deal? You're having heart surgery tomorrow." "Daniel," my father's voice held a warning. "This isn't the time." I bit back a retort, reluctant to upset my mother. But the familiar frustration with my father's controlling nature bubbled up inside me, always deciding what information was relevant, what problems were worth addressing. Just like with my collection, making unilateral decisions without considering others' feelings. "It's okay, Robert," my mother said softly. "He has a right to be upset." She turned back to me. "I didn't want to worry you, sweetheart. You were building your new life in Seattle. And yes, maybe I should have told you sooner. But what would you have done? Come home to watch me take pills?" "I would have been here," I said stubbornly. "I would have helped." "And your father was here. Is here." There was a gentleness in her rebuke that made it all the more effective. "He's been taking care of everything." I looked at my father again, seeing him through my mother's eyes for a moment. Not just the rigid, unsentimental man who had sold my treasured possessions, but a husband who had been quietly shouldering the burden of his wife's illness. The moment was interrupted by a nurse entering to check my mother's vitals. She smiled professionally at us. "Visiting hours are technically over, but since it's family and Mrs. Ashton is having surgery tomorrow, I can let you stay a bit longer. Just try to let her rest, okay?" After she left, my mother's eyes began to droop. "You boys should go home," she murmured. "Both of you need sleep." "I'm staying," my father said firmly. "No, Robert," she insisted with unexpected strength. "Go home, shower, sleep in a real bed. I'll be fine, and I need you rested for tomorrow." They locked eyes in silent communication, a language developed over decades of marriage. Finally, my father nodded. "Fine, but I'll be back first thing in the morning." "I know you will." She smiled, then turned to me. "Daniel, make sure he actually sleeps, will you? He's stubborn." "Wonder where I get that from," I said, earning a small laugh from her. We stayed until she fell asleep, the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor providing a soundtrack to our vigil. Then, with reluctance, we gathered our things and headed for the parking lot. "I'll follow you home," I told my father as we reached our cars. The drive back was short and silent, each of us alone with our thoughts. Back at the house, an awkward dance began. Two people who had once shared a home now moving carefully around each other, unsure of the boundaries. "There's leftover lasagna in the fridge if you're hungry," my father said as he headed upstairs to shower. "Your mother made it last week. She always makes too much." I heated a plate of the lasagna, recognizing my mother's recipe and the perfect balance of cheese and sauce. As I ate at the kitchen table, I noticed more details I had missed earlier. A prescription bottle on the counter, a calendar on the wall, with medical appointments circled in red, a stack of medical journals with pages marked. My father had been researching my mother's condition, educating himself, fighting in the only way he knew how, with information and preparation. It was so typical of him, this methodical approach to problem solving. It was what had made him successful in his career as an engineer, and what had often made him seem distant and analytical at home. When he came back downstairs, hair damp from the shower, we sat in the living room with mugs of decaf coffee. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken words, with the weight of our estrangement. "The surgeon has an excellent reputation," my father said finally. "Dr. Chen, he's done hundreds of these procedures." "That's good." I hesitated, then added, "You should have told me she was sick, Dad." He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "She didn't want to worry you, and it seemed manageable at first. Medication, lifestyle changes. It was only in the last month that things got worse. Still, I had a right to know." "Yes," he admitted, surprising me. "You did. I'm sorry." The simple apology, so unexpected, left me momentarily speechless. In our family, apologies had always been rare. The Ashton pride getting in the way of admitting fault. "How are things in Seattle?" he asked after a moment, an olive branch extended. "Good, busy. The company's growing fast." I took a sip of coffee. I'm up for a promotion next month. That's great, son. Your mother will be pleased to hear that. Another silence fell, but it felt less strained now. I found myself studying my father's face, noting the new lines that exhaustion and worry had etched there. For the first time, I saw him not as the authoritarian figure of my childhood, but as a man in his 60s, dealing with the potential loss of his life partner. "You should get some sleep, Dad," I said finally. "Mom's right. You need to rest." He nodded, setting down his mug. "The surgery's scheduled for 8 tomorrow. We should leave by 6:30 to be safe." "I'll be ready." As he stood to go upstairs, he paused, looking at the family photos on the mantelpiece. "She keeps that collection growing, you know, always asking for new pictures of you. She's got quite the digital album on her iPad." The mention of a collection sent a twinge through me, a reminder of what had come between us. But I said nothing, just nodded. "Good night, Daniel," he said, heading for the stairs. "Good night, Dad." Alone in the living room, I let the weight of the day settle over me. The shock of my mother's condition, the unexpected return home, the tentative reconnection with my father, it was a lot to process. I moved to the mantelpiece looking at the photos my father had been studying. There I was at various ages, grinning with missing teeth, holding up a soccer trophy, dressed up for prom, wearing a mortarboard at graduation. And there were ones I hadn't seen before, printed from social media perhaps. Me with friends in Seattle, standing by the Space Needle, at what looked like a company event. My mother, keeping track of my life from a distance. As I turned to head upstairs myself, my gaze fell on the ceiling where a small pull cord hung, leading to the attic. I hadn't thought about that space in years, had never had reason to go up there as a kid. It was my father's domain, his workshop and storage area. For a moment, curiosity tugged at me. What else might I discover about my parents' lives in my absence? But exhaustion won out, and I made my way to my childhood bedroom, falling into a restless sleep punctuated by dreams of hospitals and hidden rooms. Little did I know what secrets the attic held, waiting to be discovered. Secrets that would fundamentally change how I saw my father, and the rift that had grown between us. Chapter 4: The Surgery and the Key. The hospital waiting room was an exercise in suspended time. Minutes stretched into hours as my father and I sat side by side, occasionally making small talk but mostly silent, watching the clock on the wall tick away the seconds of my mother's surgery. A nurse had come by once to tell us that everything was proceeding as expected. My father had nodded, his face a mask of controlled worry, his hands clasped so tightly that his knuckles were white. I had brought a book but couldn't focus on the words, my mind constantly circling back to the image of my mother on the operating table. "She's always been the strong one," my father said suddenly, breaking the silence. "Did you know she was the one who proposed to me?" I was too nervous, kept putting it off. Finally, she just asked me herself. He gave a small laugh. Said she was tired of waiting for me to work up the courage. I looked at him in surprise, both at the story itself and at the fact that he was sharing it. My father had never been one for personal anecdotes or emotional revelations. "I didn't know that," I replied. 38 years, he continued, almost to himself. 38 years, and I still don't know what she saw in me. There was a vulnerability in his voice that I had never heard before, a crack in the stoic facade he usually presented to the world. It made me uncomfortable, but also curious. Who was this man, really? This person who had been my father for 28 years, but who suddenly seemed like a stranger. "She loves you," I said, the simple truth of it hanging in the air between us. He nodded, then fell silent again, retreating back into his thoughts. It was nearly noon when Dr. Chen finally appeared, still in his surgical scrubs. Both my father and I stood immediately, tension radiating from us. The surgery went well, the doctor said with a reassuring smile. We were able to place the stent without any complications. She's in recovery now, and we'll be monitoring her closely, but I'm optimistic about her prognosis. The relief was palpable, a physical sensation washing over me. My father actually swayed slightly on his feet, and I instinctively put a hand on his arm to steady him. "When can we see her?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "She'll be in recovery for another hour or so. Then we'll move her back to her room. You can see her then, but she'll be groggy from the anesthesia. I'd recommend you both get some lunch in the way. Meantime, the cafeteria is on the first floor." After the doctor left, my father and I made our way to the cafeteria, neither of us particularly hungry, but both acknowledging the need to eat. We sat at a small table by the window, picking at sandwiches and making sporadic conversation about neutral topics: the weather, a local sports team, changes in the town since I'd left. "Your mother will need to take it easy for a while after she comes home," my father said as we finished eating. The doctor mentioned a few weeks of limited activity, then cardiac rehab. He hesitated. "How long can you stay? I know you have your job, your life in Seattle." It was a question I had been asking myself since I got on the plane. I had accumulated vacation time, could probably work remotely for a bit, but eventually I would need to return to my own life. "I can take at least a week, maybe 2, I replied. "After that, I'd have to talk to my boss about working remotely." I paused. "Will you be able to manage once I'm gone?" He looked slightly offended. "I've been managing so far." "I know, I just meant, with her recovery, she'll need help with things around the house, maybe driving to appointments." "I can handle it, Daniel. I'm not completely useless." The defensiveness in his tone was familiar, the prickly pride I had butted heads with throughout my adolescence. I bit back a retort, reminding myself that we were both stressed, both worried about my mother. "I wasn't suggesting you were," I said carefully. "I just want to help while I'm here." He softened slightly. "Of course, your mother will be happy to have you home for a while." He glanced at his watch. "We should head back up. They might be moving her soon." When we returned to my mother's room, a different nurse informed us that she was still in recovery but should be brought back within the hour. My father settled into his now familiar chair by the window, while I paced the small room, restless energy making it impossible to sit still. "You never could stay in one place for long," my father observed. "Even as a little kid, always moving, always exploring." I shrugged, not sure how to respond to this unexpected reminiscence. "Your mother would get so worried when you'd wander. Often stores or at the park," he continued. "But I always told her, he'll be back. He's just curious about the world." "And you always did come back, usually full of stories about what you'd discovered." The memory brought a small smile to my face. I remember once at the mall, I ended up in the employee break room of a department store. Some lady gave me a cookie and called security. My father actually laughed. "Your mother was frantic. I think I was in trouble for weeks after that." This easy exchange, this sharing of memories without the usual undercurrent of tension, felt like stepping into alternate universe, one where the rift between us had never formed. The moment was interrupted by the arrival of an orderly pushing my mother's bed back into the room. She was pale, her eyes closed, an oxygen tube in her nose and various monitors attached to her. The sight of her looking so vulnerable sent a shock through me. The nurse followed, checking the connections on the monitors. "She's doing well," she assured us. "The anesthesia will take a while to wear off completely, so don't be alarmed if she's in and out for the next few hours." My father immediately moved to my mother's side, taking her hand gently in his. The tenderness in the gesture, the worry etched on his face, spoke volumes about the depth of his love for her. It was a side of him I rarely saw, the devoted husband, the partner who had stood beside her for nearly 4 decades. As the hours passed, my mother gradually became more alert, though still weak and groggy. When she was finally fully conscious, The relief in the room was palpable. She managed a small smile for us, squeezing my father's hand. "Did I miss anything? Exciting?" she joked weakly. "Just Dad and me having a heart-to-heart," I replied, then winced at my unfortunate choice of words. "Sorry, bad phrasing." She laughed softly. "It's okay. I'm glad you two are talking." The rest of the day passed in a blur of doctor visits, medication schedules, and quiet conversation. By evening, my mother was more alert but exhausted, and the nurse suggested we let her rest. "You should both go home," my mother insisted, echoing her words from the previous night. "I'm fine, just tired. And they have my number if anything changes," she added, gesturing to the call button beside her bed. My father was reluctant, but eventually agreed when the nurse assured him that my mother was stable and in good hands. As we gathered our things to leave, my mother caught my arm. "Daniel, there's a spare key to your father's workshop in my jewelry box," she said, her voice low. "The small wooden one on my dresser. Would you get it for me? I'd like to have it. Here?" I frowned, confused by the request. "Dad's workshop? You mean the attic?" She nodded, glancing at my father who was speaking with the nurse in the hallway. "Just bring it tomorrow, okay? Don't mention it to your father." The secretive nature of the request, so unlike my straightforward mother, left me puzzled, but I nodded, promising to bring the key. On the drive home, my father was quiet, the relief of my mother's successful surgery giving way to exhaustion. When we arrived at the house, he headed straight upstairs, murmuring something about taking a shower. Alone in the kitchen, I thought about my mother's strange request. Curiosity pulled at me, drawing my gaze to the ceiling where the attic pull cord hung. What was in my father's workshop that my mother wanted access to? And why the secrecy? I waited until I heard the shower running, then slipped into my parents' bedroom. It felt like a transgression, entering their private space without permission. But my mother's request propelled me forward. The jewelry box sat on the dresser as she had described, a small, hand-carved wooden box with a hinged lid. Inside, nestled among my mother's modest collection of jewelry, was a single key on a small ring. I pocketed it, closed the box, and quickly left the room, feeling like an intruder in my own home. Back in the kitchen, I made a pretense of preparing a light dinner, my mind racing with questions. When my father came downstairs, hair damp from the shower, I handed him a sandwich and a glass of water, trying to act normal despite the key burning a hole in my pocket. "Thanks," he said, sitting down at the table. The doctor seemed pleased with how the surgery went. "Yeah, she's tough. She'll be back on her feet in no time." I hesitated, then added, "I was thinking of staying the night at the hospital tomorrow, so you can get a full night's sleep here." He started to protest, but I cut him off. "Mom needs both of us at our best, Dad. We can take turns." After a moment, he nodded. "That makes sense. Thank you." We ate in companionable silence, the tension between us momentarily suspended by our shared concern for my mother. When we finished, my father stood, placing his plate in the sink. "I think I'll turn in early," he said. "It's been a long day." "Good night, Dad." After he went upstairs, I waited, listening for the sounds of him settling in for the night. When the house had been quiet for half an hour, I moved silently to the hallway, reaching up for the pull cord that would lower the attic stairs. The hinges creaked slightly as the folding staircase descended, and I froze, listening for any indication that my father had heard. But the house remained silent, and after a moment, I began to climb the stairs, key in hand, driven by a curiosity I couldn't explain. What I would find in that attic would change everything I thought I knew about my father, and about the collection he had sold without my permission. Chapter 5. Discoveries in Dust and Darkness. The attic was dark and smelled of dust and old wood, the air thick with the stillness of an undisturbed space. I fumbled for a light switch, finding one on the wall at the top of the stairs. A single bare bulb flickered to life, casting long shadows across the cramped space. It took my eyes a moment to adjust, and when they did, I was surprised by what I saw. Rather than the cluttered storage space I had expected, the attic was organized with almost military precision. One side held neatly labeled boxes of holiday decorations and seasonal clothing. The other side had been converted into a small workshop, with a workbench, tools hanging on a pegboard, and several shelves laden with various projects in different stages of completion. But it was what stood in the center of the space that made my breath catch in my throat. A series of display cases, carefully arranged and meticulously maintained, each containing comic books. My comic books. Or rather, what appeared to be exact duplicates of the collection my father had supposedly sold years ago. I moved forward in disbelief, my hand reaching out to touch one of the glass cases as if to confirm its reality. Inside, arranged in chronological order, were the same first-edition Batman comics I had collected throughout my teens. The next case held my Spider-Man series, and another my rare Silver Surfer issues. But it wasn't just comics. Against the far wall stood shelving units with glass doors, behind which were displayed the action figures and memorabilia that had been part of my collection. Everything was there, from my mint-condition Star Wars figures to the limited edition movie props I had saved up for months to purchase. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Had my father lied about selling my collection? But if so, why? And why go to the trouble of setting everything up here in a space I never visited? As I moved deeper into the attic, other details came into focus. On the workbench lay tools I didn't recognize. A magnifying glass on an articulated arm, small brushes, tweezers, and what looked like specialized cleaning equipment. Beside them was an open ledger, filled with my father's neat, engineer's handwriting. I picked up the ledger, scanning the entries. They were dated, going back years, with notes about purchases, restorations, and what appeared to be market values. With growing disbelief, I realized that my father had not only preserved my collection, but had been actively expanding it. The DA's latest entry was from just 2 weeks ago. Acquired Batman Uber 121, first appearance of Poison Ivy. Minor foxing on cover, otherwise excellent condition. Paid $1,800, current market value approximately $2,200. I set the ledger down, my hands shaking slightly. Nothing about this made sense. My father, who had dismissed my comics as childish, who had told me he'd sold them at a yard sale, had instead been secretly curating and expanding the collection for years. My eye caught on something else, a row of photo albums on a shelf above the workbench. I pulled one down, opening it to find pictures of me at various comic conventions, proudly holding new acquisitions. These were mixed with photos I'd never seen before, of my father at auctions and comic shops, sometimes with dealers I recognized from the convention circuit. There was a photo of him shaking hands with Martin Goodman, a well-known comic book collector and dealer who I had met a few times at conventions. In the photo, my father was grinning, looking more relaxed and happy than I could remember seeing him in real life. The cognitive dissonance was dizzying. This couldn't be my father, my practical, no-nonsense father who had ridiculed my hobby, who had dismissed comics as a waste of time and money. And yet, here was undeniable evidence that, not only did he understand my passion, he seemed to share it. As I continued to explore, I found a locked cabinet beside the workbench. The key my mother had directed me to fit perfectly, turning with a satisfying click. Inside were folders, neatly labeled and organized chronologically. I pulled out the first one, dated from around the time I had left for college. Inside were receipts, certificates of authenticity, and insurance documents. But what caught my eye was a letter, written on the letterhead of Heritage Auctions, a major auction house for collectibles. "Dear Mr. Ashton," it began, We are writing to confirm the details of our agreement regarding your son's comic book collection. As discussed, we will be preparing a complete catalog of the items for the upcoming auction. Our conservative estimate for the total value of the collection is $38,000, though certain rare items may drive that figure higher. I stared at the letter, my mind struggling to process its implications. My father had planned to auction my collection, but that didn't align with what he had told me, that he'd sold everything at a yard sale for a fraction of its worth. I moved to the next folder, which contained more letters from Heritage, along with what appeared to be auction results. But then, a handwritten note from my father to someone named Edward Jenkins at the auction house. Edward, I need to cancel the auction. Immediately. I've reconsidered and cannot part with my son's collection. Please return all items as soon as possible. I'll cover any expenses incurred. The next document was a shipping receipt for the return of the entire collection, dated just a month before I had come home and discovered it missing. My hands were shaking as I opened the next folder. Inside was a medical bill from Cleveland Clinic, dated around the same time, with a highlighted total that made my stomach drop: $35,000. And attached to it, a note in my mother's handwriting. Robert, we need to talk about this. There must be another way. The pieces began to fall into place. A terrible, tragic puzzle that made my heart ache. My father had considered selling my collection to pay for what appeared to be a medical expense for my mother. But he had changed his mind, retrieved the collection, and then lied to me about selling it? It still didn't make sense. Why not just tell me the truth? Why create this elaborate fiction about a yard sale, knowing it would drive a wedge between us? The answer came in the next folder, which contained a series of emails between my father and various dealers and collectors. The subject line of one caught my eye: Re-authentication services for comic collection insurance. I began reading, and the final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. My father had discovered that several key items in my collection, items I had purchased as a teenager from a dealer at a local convention, were forgeries. Not worthless exactly, but worth a fraction of what I believed them to be. What I had paid for them. The emails detailed my father's efforts to have the collection properly authenticated and appraised for insurance purposes, leading to the discovery that I had been scammed. His indignation was clear in the terse language of his emails, his determination to hold the fraudulent dealer accountable evident in his pursuit of legal options. But what struck me most was an email draft, never sent, addressed to me. Daniel, I don't know how to tell you this without breaking your heart. The Batman 27 and Action Comics 252 you were so proud of that you saved for years to buy, they're not real. That dealer, Jensen, took advantage of you. I've been looking into legal options, but without proof of fraud, there's little recourse. I know how much the collection means to you, how much pride you take in it. I can't bear to tell you the truth and see the disappointment in your eyes. The email was never finished, never sent. Instead, my father had created an elaborate deception, pretending to sell my collection, allowing me to believe he did so out of a lack of respect for my interests, and bearing my anger and resentment rather than revealing the truth. And then, based on the evidence before me, he had spent the years since not only preserving my collection, but enhancing it, replacing the forgeries with genuine articles, expanding it with new acquisitions, all while I was in Seattle, believing he had discarded a part of my identity without a second thought. The revelation left me reeling. I sat on a dusty stool by the workbench, surrounded by the physical manifestation of my father's secret devotion, trying to reconcile this new reality with the narrative I had constructed and lived with for years. My father wasn't the dismissive, insensitive man I had believed him to be. He was something far more complex, a man who had shouldered my resentment rather than destroy my illusions, who had quietly cultivated and cared for something that mattered to me, even when I was no longer there to know or appreciate it. A creak on the stairs startled me out of my thoughts. I turned to see my father standing at the top of the attic steps, still in his pajamas, his expression a mixture of surprise and resignation. "Daniel," he said quietly, "what are you doing up here?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy, with the weight of years of misunderstanding and unspoken truths. I held up the key my mother had given me wordlessly. He nodded slowly, understanding dawning in his eyes. "Your mother," he said, a small smile touching his lips. "Always the peacemaker." "Dad," I began, my voice thick with emotion. "I don't understand." "Why didn't you just tell me the truth?" He sighed, moving fully into the attic and lowering himself onto an old chair opposite me. In the harsh glare of the bare bulb, he looked older, more vulnerable than I had ever seen him. "I meant to," he said finally. "I had it all planned out. I was going to explain about the forgeries, show you the documentation, assure you that we would replace them with genuine articles over time." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture of frustration I recognized from my own reflection. "But then, when I saw how excited you were about those particular comics, how proud you were of finding them, of negotiating the price down, I couldn't do it. I couldn't take that away from you. So you decided to let me believe you'd thrown away my entire collection instead?" The anger in my voice surprised me. I thought I had moved past it years ago, but here it was, fresh and raw. "No, that was never the plan." He looked down at his hands. "I was going to tell you everything when you came home for break, but then your mother's first diagnosis came and I was distracted. By the time you arrived, I hadn't figured out how to approach it. And then you found the empty closet, jumped to conclusions, and I froze. I let you believe what you wanted to believe? For 3 years? You let me hate you for 3 years rather than explain?" He met my eyes directly. "You were already gone, Daniel, already building your new life in Seattle. What would telling you have accomplished, except to make you feel foolish for being taken in by that dealer? To taint memories you cherished? And yes, maybe part of me thought it was easier this way, to be the villain in your story rather than watch you realize you'd been deceived." The admission hung in the air between us, honest in a way my father rarely was. I looked around at the carefully preserved collection, the evidence of years of meticulous care and expansion. "And all this?" I asked, gesturing to the displays. "What was the point if I was never supposed to see it?" A shadow passed over his face. "I don't know, exactly. At first, I just couldn't bring myself to actually get rid of it. It felt wrong. Somehow. Then, when I started researching to understand what you had and what it was worth, I found myself drawn in. The history, the artistry, the storytelling." He shrugged, embarrassed. "I guess I wanted to understand what you saw in them. And somewhere along the way, I began to see it too." The admission was so unexpected, so contrary to everything I had believed about my father, that I didn't know how to respond. "And then," he continued softly, "it became a way to stay connected to you, even when you weren't speaking to me. Each new edition, each restoration, it was like a conversation we might have had if things had been different." The lump in my throat made it hard to speak. I picked up one of the photo albums, opening to a picture of my father at a comic convention, examining a display. "How did you learn all this?" I asked. "The restoration, the authentication, the market values?" "The same way I learn everything," he replied with a small smile. "Research, practice, talking to experts. I'm an engineer, Daniel. Once I decide to understand something, I'm quite thorough." That, at least, was familiar. The methodical, dedicated approach that had defined my father's career and, apparently, his secret hobby. "Your mother knows, of course," he added. "She thought I was crazy at first, spending so much time up here. But she understood what I was trying to do in her way. She's always understood me better than I understand myself. I thought of my mother's request, the key she had directed me to find. She wanted me to see this, I realized aloud. That's why she asked for the key. My father nodded. She's been after me for years, to tell you the truth, to show you all this. But I was afraid, I suppose. Afraid that the damage was done, that you wouldn't understand or wouldn't care. And then she had a heart attack, I finished for him. Yes. His voice was barely audible. And suddenly, all the things left unsaid between us seemed much more important. We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of revelation settling around us. I looked at my father, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years, and saw not the rigid, emotionally distant man I had resented, but someone more complex, more human. A father who had made mistakes, but who had also demonstrated a love more enduring and profound than I had ever given him credit for. I'm still angry, I said finally. Not about the collection, about the lie. About the years we lost because you couldn't bring yourself to tell me the truth. He nodded, accepting the rebuke. I know, and you have every right to be. I made a choice that hurt you, that drove you away. I can't change that now, no matter how much I wish I could. But, I continued, surprising myself, I think I'm starting to understand why you did it. And maybe that's a place to start, to rebuild. The hope that flickered across his face was almost painful to witness. A man who had resigned, himself to permanent estrangement from his son, suddenly glimpsing the possibility of reconciliation. I'd like that, he said simply. Then, gesturing to the collection around us, he added, and I'd like to show you what I've been working on, if you're interested. There's a first edition Silver Surfer I just finished restoring that I think you'll appreciate. The enthusiasm in his voice, so at odds with the reserved man I had known, brought an unexpected smile to my face. I'd like that too, I replied. But not tonight. It's late and we both need sleep if we're going to be any use to Mom tomorrow. As we descended the attic stairs together, a tentative new understanding between us, I realized that this homecoming, forced by circumstance, had opened a door I had believed permanently closed. The path to reconciliation wouldn't be easy or straightforward. There were still wounds on both sides, still truths to be confronted and processed. But for the first time in years, I could see a way forward. In my childhood bedroom that night, listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the house settling, I reflected on the strange turns life can take. I had returned home expecting to find nothing but the ghost of old resentments. Instead, I had discovered a story of sacrifice, devotion, and the complicated, imperfect ways that love sometimes manifests. My father had sold my collection without permission, yes, but what I found in his attic had indeed changed everything. Chapter 6. Hospital Conversations. The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beeping of monitors and the occasional squeak of nurses' shoes in the corridor. Outside, my mother was sitting up in bed, looking noticeably better than the day before. Some color had returned to her cheeks, and though she was clearly tired, her eyes were alert and focused. "You found it," she said as I handed her the key. Her gaze was searching, trying to read my expression. "And? Why didn't you tell me, Mom?" I asked, pulling a chair close to her bedside. "All these years, you let me believe that Dad had just discarded something that mattered to me. You knew how much that hurt." She sighed, turning the key over in her fingers. "I wanted to. So many times. But your father—" She shook her head. "Robert has always had his own way of showing love. Not always the right way, but his way. He thought he was protecting you." "From what? From knowing I'd been scammed? I was 19, not 9. "It wasn't just that." She reached for my hand. "You were so proud of those finds, so excited about building your collection. And then there was the money. Money you'd saved. From summer jobs, birthday gifts. He couldn't bear to tell you that you'd been taken advantage of. I thought back to those days, to my excitement when I'd found what I thought were incredible deals on rare comics. The dealer, Jensen, had seemed so knowledgeable, so trustworthy. He had spun stories about where the comics had come from, about their provenance and rarity, and I had believed every word. And then, my mother continued, when he realized what had happened, you were already away at college. He was going to tell you when you came home for break, but then you got sick. I finished for her. She nodded. The first diagnosis. It wasn't as serious as now. A minor blockage, treatable with medication and lifestyle changes. But the insurance wouldn't cover some of the tests, and the medication was expensive. She gave a small, bitter laugh. The American healthcare system at its finest. And Dad considered selling my collection to cover the costs, I said, thinking of the documents I had found in the attic. He did more than consider it. He had it all arranged with an auction house, but at the last minute he couldn't go through with it. He called it off, got everything back. She squeezed my hand. You know your father. Once he commits to something, that's it. And he had committed to preserving what mattered to you, even if you never knew about it. But when I found the empty closet and confronted him, he let me believe he'd sold everything at a yard sale. He let me walk away angry, let me stay angry for years. My mother's expression was soft with understanding. By then, I think he believed it was too late, that the damage was done. And in his mind, maybe it was better for you to be angry at him for the wrong reason than to know you'd been deceived. She paused. Your father, he's not good with emotions, with vulnerability. Never has been. It was easier for him to be the villain in your story than to explain the truth and risk. I don't know. Risk you feeling foolish or hurt in a different way. I shook my head, struggling to reconcile this new narrative with the one I had lived with for so long. It's a lot to process, Mom. I know, sweetheart, and I'm not saying he was right. Just that in his own way, he thought he was doing what was best for you. She studied my face. Did you two talk last night? After you found the attic? A little. It was late and we were both tired. But yes, we talked. He showed me some of what he's been doing with the collection. A small smile lifted the corners of her mouth. He's become quite the expert, you know. Spends hours up there, researching, restoring. It started as a way to keep your collection intact, but I think somewhere along the way, he actually developed a genuine interest. The image of my father, my practical, pragmatic father, hunched over comic books with tweezers and special cleaning solutions, was still difficult to reconcile with the man I had known growing up. You should have seen him. When he found that Silver Surfer issue you'd been looking for, my mother continued, a hint of amusement in her voice. He was like a kid on Christmas morning, called me upstairs to show me, explaining all about the significance of that particular issue, the condition, the price he'd negotiated. I didn't understand half of it, but his excitement? She shook, her head smiling at the memory. I tried to imagine my father excited about comics, about collectibles, the very things he had seemed to disdain when I was growing up. It was like trying to picture a different person entirely. He made some bad choices, my mother acknowledged, reading my expression. But Daniel, he loves you, more than he knows how to express. Before I could respond, there was a soft knock at the door, and my father entered, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. He looked surprised to see me already there. I thought you were going to sleep in, he said, setting the flowers on the windowsill. Couldn't sleep, I replied. Thought I'd come early so you could have a break. An awkward silence fell, the three of us acutely aware of the shift in dynamics following the previous night's revelations. I brought you a change of clothes, I told my mother, indicating the bag I had placed beside her bed. And your tablet, in case you get bored. Thank you, sweetheart. She glanced between my father and me, then said with forced casualness, Robert, have you shown Daniel the new Batman acquisition? The one with Poison Ivy's first appearance? My father shot her a look that was part exasperation, part gratitude for the conversation opener. Not yet, he replied. We didn't get that far last night. It's in incredible condition, she continued, clearly determined to push us into conversation. Your father spent months tracking down a copy that met his standards. It's nothing special, my father said, though I could detect a hint of pride beneath the modesty. Just a decent example of an important issue. He's being modest, my mother told me. He found it through that dealer in Chicago. What's his name, Robert? Lawrence, my father supplied. Lawrence Chen. The name was familiar. From Century Comics? I asked, surprised. I used to read his price guides in college. My father nodded. He's a good resource. Very knowledgeable. Very fair. He also doesn't let just anyone access his inventory, I noted. How did you manage that? A slight flush colored my father's cheeks. I may have mentioned that I was building a collection for my son, who was a serious collector. This unexpected admission that he had been using my name, my reputation as a collector, to access exclusive inventories hit me in an unexpected way. It was another piece of evidence of the lengths he had gone to, the thought he had put into preserving and expanding the collection in my absence. He has quite the network now, my mother added. Dealers call him when something special comes in that might fit with Daniel's collection. My father looked embarrassed by this revelation. It's not a big deal. Just a few contacts I've made over the years. He's being modest again, my mother stage whispered to me. Last year, he flew to a convention in San Diego specifically to bid on a rare issue he knew you'd been looking for. Comic-Con? I asked, incredulous. The image of my father, in his button-down shirt and sensible shoes, navigating the costumed crowds of the world's largest comic convention was almost too much to process. It was a business trip, he said defensively. I had a conference in the area. The convention just happened to be at the same time. My mother rolled her eyes fondly. The conference ended 2 days before the convention started. He extended his trip specifically to attend. I looked at my father with new eyes, seeing him not as the rigid authority figure of my childhood, but as a man with complexities and contradictions I had never bothered to look for. A man who had found a way to connect with his son's interests, even when that son was no longer present to appreciate it. I'd like to hear more about it, I said, surprising both him and myself. About the collection, the acquisitions, the restoration, work. The hope that flickered across his face was quickly masked, but not before I caught it. Of course, he said, trying for nonchalance. Whenever you'd like. My mother beamed at us both, satisfaction evident in her expression. Well, she said brightly, since I have both of you here, I should tell you what the doctor said this morning. He stopped by early for rounds. She proceeded to give us an update on her condition. The surgery had been successful. Her vitals were good, and if everything continued to progress well, she might be released in another day or two, but she would need to take it easy for several weeks, attend cardiac rehabilitation sessions, and make some significant lifestyle changes. Which means, she concluded, looking at us both, that I'm going to need help around the house for a while. Daniel, I know you can't stay indefinitely, but I'll stay as long as I can, Mom, I assured her, and we'll figure out a plan for after I have to go back. My father nodded in agreement. We'll manage, he said. And for once, the statement didn't sound like a dismissal of help, but a genuine commitment to finding a solution together. As we discussed practical arrangements, medication schedules, dietary restrictions, follow-up appointments, I noticed a new ease in our interactions. The air had been cleared, at least partially. The secret that had been lurking in the attic had been brought into the light, and while its revelation hadn't erased years of misunderstanding and estrangement, it had created an opening, a possibility. for something new to grow in the space between us. Later, when the nurse came to check my mother's vitals, my father and I stepped out into the hallway to give her some privacy. We stood awkwardly for a moment, neither quite sure how to navigate this new territory. "I was thinking," my father said finally, "that we might set up a temporary bedroom for your mother on the first floor, so she doesn't have to deal with the stairs right away. There's that small office that we never really use. We could move some furniture around." "That's a good idea," I agreed. "We could do that today so it's ready when she comes home." He nodded, and we lapsed into silence again. Then, with visible effort, he said, "Daniel, about last night. About everything you found in the attic. We don't have to talk about it now, Dad," I interrupted, sensing his discomfort. "We have time." Relief flickered across his face. "Thank you," he said simply. Then, after a pause, "Would you be interested in joining me at an auction next weekend? There's an estate sale with some promising items. Nothing extraordinary, but a few pieces that might fill some gaps in the collection." The invitation, so tentative and hopeful, touched something in me I hadn't realized was still tender. "I'd like that," I replied, and was rewarded with a smile that transformed my father's face, making him look younger, more like the man in the photographs I had discovered in the attic. When we returned to my mother's room, she was sitting up straighter, looking pleased with herself. "The nurse says I'm making excellent progress," she announced. "If my numbers stay good, I might be home as early as tomorrow afternoon." "That's great news, Mom," I said, genuinely relieved. "Dad and I were just discussing setting up a temporary bedroom for you on the first floor, so you don't have to worry about stairs right away." "Always the problem solvers, my men," she said fondly. "But before you go rearranging the entire house, there's something I want to talk to both of you about." She took a deep breath. "This health scare. It's made me think about what's important. About the time we've lost, the years we've spent, estranged when we could have been a family." My father shifted uncomfortably, not meeting my eyes. "Catherine, maybe now isn't the time." "On the contrary, Robert," she replied firmly. "Now is exactly the time. Life is too short for secrets and misunderstandings." She reached for both our hands, pulling us closer to her bedside. "I want us to start again. Clean slate. No more half-truths, no more avoidance, no more letting pride get in the way of love." Her directness, so characteristic of her, yet still sometimes startling, left no room for evasion. My father and I exchanged glances, bound together in this moment by a shared recognition of the second chance being offered. "I'd like that," I said finally, squeezing her hand. "I've missed you both, more than I realized." My father cleared, his throat, his discomfort with emotional declarations evident in the rigid set of his shoulders. But when he spoke, his voice was steady. "I've made mistakes," he said simply. "Many of them. And I'm sorry for the hurt they've caused." Coming from him, a man who rarely apologized, who viewed emotional vulnerability as a weakness, the words carried a weight that more effusive expressions might not have. My mother's eyes shone with unshed tears. "Well," she said, attempting a light tone, "now that we've got that out of the way, I have a real craving for something other than hospital food. Robert, be a dear and see if you can find some decent coffee in this place, and maybe something chocolate." It was a transparent attempt to give us a moment alone, but my father played along, excusing himself with a promise to find the best provisions available. When he was gone, my mother turned to me, her expression serious. "He's trying, Daniel. In his own way. And he has been for years, even when you couldn't see it." "I know that now," I replied. "The attic, it's like discovering a whole different person, a person I never knew existed." "He's the same person he's always been," she corrected gently, "just with parts you never took the time to see, parts he never knew how to show you." She paused, considering. You're more alike than either of you realize, you know. Both stubborn, both proud, both terrible at saying what you really mean. I couldn't help but smile at that. Fair point, though I like to think I'm slightly better at the emotional communication thing. Slightly, she agreed with a teasing glint in her eye. Then, more seriously, give him a chance, Daniel. Give both of you a chance to know each other as adults, not just as father and son with all the baggage that comes with those roles. I'm trying, I admitted. It's just a lot to process. Finding out that everything I believed for years was based on a misunderstanding, a well-intentioned lie. It changes how I see him, but it also changes how I see myself, the grudges I've held, the assumptions I've made. That's growth, she said simply. Painful, messy, but necessary. And it's never too late to start. She squeezed my hand. Promise me you'll try. Even after you go back to Seattle, even when it's easier to fall back into old patterns of distance and silence. The intensity in her eyes, the implicit acknowledgement of her own mortality that underlay the request, made it impossible to refuse. I promise, I said, and meant it. When my father returned with coffee and a smuggled chocolate bar, the three of us sat together, talking not about the past or the future, but about simple, present things, the improving weather, a funny story the nurse had shared, plans for my mother's homecoming. It wasn't perfect, wasn't free of awkward pauses or moments of uncertainty, but it was a beginning, a tentative rebuilding of bridges long thought burned beyond repair. As I watched my parents together, my father automatically adjusting my mother's pillow for comfort, my mother intuitively understanding when to push him and when to let him retreat, I saw the complex dance of a long marriage, the deep understanding that comes from decades of shared life. And I realized how little I had known about their relationship, about the ways they complemented and supported each other. It was strange to think that at 28, I was still discovering fundamental truths about the people who had raised me. Still learning that parents are not just the roles they play in our lives, but complex, flawed individuals with their own stories, their own reasons for the choices they make. In the attic the night before, I had discovered that my father wasn't the man I had believed him to be. But here, in this hospital room, I was beginning to learn who he actually was, who both my parents were, beyond the narrow lens through which I had viewed them for so long. It was a revelation as significant as what I had found in the dusty light of the attic, perhaps even more so. Chapter 7. Homecoming. The day my mother was discharged from the hospital dawned bright and clear, a perfect early autumn day with crisp air and leaves just beginning to turn. My father and I had spent the previous day preparing the house, transforming the small first-floor study into a temporary bedroom, stocking the kitchen with heart-healthy foods, and generally ensuring that everything was ready for her return. Working together had been a strange experience, at once familiar and foreign. We had fallen into old patterns easily enough, my father taking the lead, delegating tasks with the efficiency that had characterized my childhood. But there were new elements too, moments when he deferred to my suggestions, times when he asked, rather than instructed. Small shifts, perhaps imperceptible to an outside observer, but significant in the context of our historically rigid relationship. Now, as we drove home from the hospital, my mother in the passenger seat of my father's car and me following behind in my rental, I found myself thinking about the notion of homecoming, what it meant to return to a place that had been both sanctuary and battleground to people who were simultaneously the most familiar and the most mysterious figures in my life. At the house, we settled into a new routine almost immediately. My mother, despite her protests that she was perfectly fine, was instructed to rest frequently. My father and I took turns helping with her medication, preparing meals, and keeping her company. The forced proximity, the shared purpose of my mother's care, created a space for conversation that had been lacking in our relationship for years. On the third day after her return, I found myself alone in the house with my father. My mother had fallen asleep after lunch, and we were sitting at the kitchen table, drinking coffee and reviewing her medication schedule. "The cardiologist's office called while you were out this morning," my father informed me. "They've scheduled her first rehabilitation session for next Tuesday." I made a note in the shared calendar we had set up on our phones. "I can drive her to that one, but I'll need to head back to Seattle the following weekend. My boss is being understanding, but there's a project deadline coming up." He nodded, unsurprised. "We'll manage. Mrs. Peterson next door has offered to help with driving if needed, and I can work from home most days." He hesitated, then added, "But we appreciate the time you've been able to give us, Daniel. It means a lot to your mother, to both of us." The simple acknowledgement, so unlike the man who had rarely expressed gratitude or appreciation during my childhood, caught me off guard. "Of course," I replied awkwardly. "She's my mother." A silence fell between us, not entirely uncomfortable, but laden with the weight of things still unspoken. Finally, my father cleared his throat. "I was thinking," he began, his tone deliberately casual, "that we might spend some time in the attic this afternoon while your mother is resting. If you're interested, that is. There are some items in the collection I'd like to show you, get your opinion on." The invitation was transparent in its intent. An olive branch, an opportunity to connect over the shared interests that had once divided us. "I'd like that," I said, and was rewarded with a brief, genuine smile that transformed my father's usually stern features. The attic, when we ascended the narrow stairs that afternoon, seemed different in the daylight. Dust motes danced in the sunlight that streamed through a small window, illuminating the space that had seemed so mysterious and revelatory in the darkness just days before. My father moved with confidence through the room, navigating between display cases with the ease of long familiarity. He stopped before one of the glass cabinets, unlocking it with a small key from his pocket. "This is what I wanted to show you," he said, carefully removing a comic book encased in a protective sleeve. "Batman Dupper 121. First appearance of Poison. Ivy. I acquired it about 2 weeks ago." He handed it to me with a care that spoke volumes about its value, both monetary and personal. I examined it, noting the vibrant colors, the minimal wear on the edges, the overall excellent condition. "It's beautiful," I said honestly. "Near mint." He nodded, pleased by my assessment. 9.2 on the CGC scale, according to the certification. Not perfect, but exceptional for its age. "How did you find it?" I asked, genuinely curious. "Through Lawrence Chen, as your mother mentioned. He knew I'd been looking for a high-grade copy for a while." A hint of pride crept into his voice. "He had 2 potential buyers, but he called me first." "That's impressive," I acknowledged. Chen is known for being selective about his clients. My father shrugged, but I could tell he was pleased by the validation. "We've built a relationship over the years. Trust goes a long way in this field." He moved to another cabinet, showing me more treasures from his collection. The mahogany. Doors swung open to reveal rows of carefully arranged items, each one displayed with museum-like precision. "This section is mostly European," he explained, gesturing to a shelf of delicate porcelain figurines. "Late 18th century, mostly from Meissen and Sèvres manufactories. The craftsmanship is extraordinary. Look at the detail in the faces." I leaned closer, studying a tiny shepherdess with a painted expression so lifelike it seemed she might speak. The glaze had the soft luminosity that only comes with age and quality. "And this," he continued, reaching for a small wooden box, "is something special." He opened it with reverent hands to reveal a pocket watch nestled on velvet. The case was gold, adorned with intricate engravings and a small diamond at the crown. "Breguet," I whispered, recognizing the maker's distinctive style. My father's eyebrows rose in surprise. You know your timepieces. I've picked up a few things. I didn't mention the hours I'd spent researching horology after our last conversation about his collection. How I'd wanted to have something, anything, to discuss with him. He handed me the watch, and I was surprised by its weight. 1789, he said. It belonged to a French aristocrat who barely escaped the revolution. See the initials on the back? I turned it over. GDM was engraved in flowing script. Gaspard de Montmorency, my father explained. The watch made it out of France with him, though most of his other possessions were lost. It passed through several hands before ending up at auction in Geneva 3 years ago. It's beautiful, I said, carefully returning it to its box. Does it still work? Of course. He seemed almost offended by the question. I have it serviced regularly. All. My pieces are functional. What's the point otherwise? Beauty should have purpose. I nodded, though I wasn't entirely sure I agreed. Sometimes beauty was enough on its own. Follow me, he said suddenly, moving toward the far corner of the room. There's something else I want to show you. He led me to what appeared to be a solid wall, but when he pressed a concealed button, a hidden door swung open. You have a secret room? I couldn't keep the incredulity from my voice. That's a bit dramatic, isn't it? He chuckled, a rare sound that momentarily transported me back to childhood. Practical? Not dramatic. Some pieces require additional security, and others... He paused. Let's just say provenance can be complicated. The hidden room was smaller than the main collection space, but just as meticulously organized. Climate. Control hummed quietly in the background, maintaining perfect temperature and humidity. The lighting was soft but precise, illuminating each item without risking damage. This is my newest acquisition, he said, directing my attention to a glass case in the center of the room. Inside was a book, ancient, with a worn leather binding and pages that had clearly yellowed with age. It was open to reveal text in what looked like Latin and intricate illustrations in faded ink and gold leaf. 15th century illuminated manuscript, he explained. From a monastery in northern Italy, one of only 3 known copies. It's incredible, I murmured, genuinely impressed. How did you even find something like this? Patience. Years of it. His voice softened. I first saw a reference to it in a catalog 20 years ago, when you were still a child. I've been tracking it ever since. 20 years. While I was growing up, going through school, building my career, my father had been pursuing this single object with unwavering focus. I wasn't sure whether to find that admirable or sad. What's it about? I asked, studying the illuminations of saints and angels. It's a theological text primarily, discussions of divine grace, but what makes it valuable are the marginalia. He pointed to tiny notes scribbled in the margins. The monk who wrote, "These was later tried for heresy." His commentary contradicts several established church doctrines of the time. I looked up at him, suddenly curious. Are you interested in the religious aspect? He considered this for a moment. Not particularly. I'm not a religious man, as you know. But I'm fascinated by those who risk everything for their ideas. This monk knew the danger of what he was writing, yet he couldn't help himself. Compulsion is an interesting human trait. Our eyes met, and for a moment I glimpsed something I rarely saw in my father. Vulnerability, perhaps, or self-awareness. Would you like some tea? He asked abruptly, breaking the moment. I have a gin May that's exceptional. That would be nice, I said, following him out of the hidden room. As he closed the concealed door, seamlessly blending it back into the wall, I wondered if that's what he did with his emotions as well, tucked them away behind careful barriers where they couldn't be easily accessed. In the kitchen, which was as immaculate as the rest of the house, He moved with practiced efficiency, heating water to the precise temperature and measuring tea leaves with the same care he showed his collectibles. "Mom mentioned you're retiring next year," I said, taking a seat at the island. He nodded, not looking up from his preparation. "That's the plan. 43 years is enough. Do you have any, plans? For after?" His hands paused momentarily. "I have several pieces I'm tracking, and there's a symposium in Vienna I've been asked to speak at." He poured the steaming water over the leaves. "Beyond that, I haven't given it much thought." "You could travel," I suggested. "Not for acquisitions, just to see places." He gave me a curious look as he set the teapot down to steep. "Is that what you do?" The question caught me off guard. My father rarely asked about my preferences or opinions. "I suppose I would. There are so many places I haven't seen yet, such as Kyoto during cherry blossom season, the Northern Lights in Iceland, the ruins at Petra." I shrugged. "Just places I've read about." He nodded thoughtfully. "I've been to Kyoto, but never during Hanami. It might be worth seeing." He poured the tea into 2 delicate cups without handles. "My colleague Hayashi could arrange a viewing of some private collections while there." I suppressed a smile. Even in hypothetical leisure, he couldn't help thinking about acquisitions. "This is excellent," I said after tasting the tea. Its flavor was complex, honey and orchid notes with a mineral finish. "Yes," he agreed. "The soil on that particular mountainside creates a distinctive profile." We sat in silence for a few minutes, drinking our tea. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence, which was unusual for us. Typically, our quiet moments were tense, filled with things unsaid. This felt different, almost peaceful. "Your mother tells me you're considering a position at the Westmore Institute," he said finally. I nodded. "It's a good opportunity. Their research aligns with my interests, and the funding is secure for at least 5 years. It's also 3,000 miles away," he observed, his tone neutral. I met his gaze. "Yes, it is. Is that part of the appeal?" The directness of the question startled me. "I'm not running away if that's what you're asking. Aren't you?" His expression remained calm, but his eyes were intent. "We've never discussed it, but I'm aware that our relationship has been challenging." I almost laughed at the understatement, challenging, as if we were discussing a mildly difficult puzzle rather than decades of emotional distance. "I'm not taking the job to get away from you, Dad. I'm taking it because it's the right move for my career." I paused, then added, "But I won't pretend the distance is a deterrent." He nodded, accepting this with unexpected grace. "Fair enough." He refilled our cups. "What will you be researching?" "Neural plasticity in traumatic brain injury patients, specifically new approaches to cognitive rehabilitation." "Important work," he said, and I was surprised by the note of approval in his voice. "I think so." I hesitated, then asked, "Would you and Mom come visit if I took the position?" He considered this. "Your mother would certainly want to. She's been talking about seeing the California coast for years." "And you?" His eyes met mine. "If invited, yes." Something shifted in that moment. A tiny adjustment in the delicate mechanism of our relationship. Not a repair exactly, but an acknowledgement that repair might be possible. "I'd like that," I said quietly. He nodded, then glanced at his watch. "I have a call with a collector in Singapore in 15 minutes. But before that..." He stood. "There's one more thing I'd like to show you." He led me back to the main collection room and approached a small safe I hadn't noticed before, tucked into the wall behind his desk. After entering a combination, he opened it and removed a small object wrapped in silk. "I was saving this," he said, unwrapping the bundle to reveal a small jade carving of a horse. It was simple but beautiful, the stone a deep, translucent green that seemed to glow from within. Ming Dynasty, I guessed. No, he said, a hint of amusement in his voice. Much more recent. He turned the piece over, revealing tiny characters carved into the base. I leaned closer to read them. Happy 8th birthday with love, I translated, my breath catching. This was mine? You don't remember? There was disappointment in his voice. I shook my head, feeling guilty. I'm sorry. Don't be. You were young and it was only in your possession for a few weeks. His fingers traced the edge of the carving. You left it on the window ledge in the sunroom, and when I found it, I was upset. It's valuable, and the direct sunlight could have damaged it. I had a vague recollection then. My father's stern voice, my tears, the sense of having disappointed him yet again. I took it back, he continued, saying you weren't responsible enough yet. I promised to return it when you were older. His eyes met mine. I believe that time has come. He held out the jade horse, and I took it, feeling its cool weight in my palm. It's yours, he said. Always has been. The gesture moved me in a way I hadn't expected. This small piece of jade represented something I'd long given up hope for, my father's trust, and perhaps something more. Thank you, I said, closing, my fingers around it. I'll take good care of it this time. I know you will. He checked his watch again. I should prepare for my call. Will you be all right finding your way out? Of course, I said, recognizing the dismissal but not minding it as much as I might have before. I'll see you at Mom's birthday dinner on Sunday? He nodded. I'll be there. And perhaps we could have lunch next week? There's a new exhibition at the museum I thought might interest you. I'd like that, I said, surprised by the invitation, and even more surprised to find I genuinely meant it. As I left the house, the jade horse secure in my pocket, I felt something I hadn't experienced around my father in years. Hope. Not for a perfect relationship, but for something better than what we'd had. Something real. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother. How did it go? I smiled, typing back. Better than expected. I'll tell you tomorrow. Then I added, he showed me his collection. Some of it's actually pretty amazing. As I walked to my car, I realized that maybe, just maybe, the same could be said about my father himself. The drive home took longer than expected. A sudden downpour reduced visibility, forcing me to slow to a crawl along with the rest of traffic on the highway. I didn't mind. The extra time gave me space to process the afternoon's unexpected developments. I played classical music, Chopin, nocturnes, my father's favorite, and occasionally reached into my pocket to touch the jade horse, as if to confirm it wasn't a figment of my imagination. Its smooth contours had an almost talismanic quality, a physical representation of something long absent finally being offered. By the time I pulled into my apartment complex, the rain had stopped, leaving everything with that peculiar glistening quality that follows a storm. Water droplets trembled on leaves and railings, catching the emerging sunlight and fracturing it into tiny rainbows. Inside, I placed the jade horse on my bookshelf, positioning it carefully among my small collection of meaningful objects. A piece of sea glass from my first solo trip abroad, a fountain pen my graduate advisor had given me upon completion of my dissertation, a small framed photo of my mother and me laughing on a beach somewhere. I studied the arrangement, considering how strange it was to suddenly have a piece of my father there among these treasured items. How strange, and yet how right it felt. My phone rang. Lauren's name flashed on the screen. So? She asked immediately after I answered. How bad was it? Do you need emergency drinks? I laughed. Lauren had been my closest friend since graduate school, and she'd heard every complicated story about my father over the years. Her standing offer of emergency drinks after family encounters was a tradition. Actually, it was not terrible, I said, settling onto my couch. Define not terrible, she replied, skepticism evident in her voice. He showed me his collection, really showed me with explanations and context. We had tea. He asked about my research and the position at Westmore. I paused, and he gave me a gift. A gift? The disbelief in her voice was almost comical. Your father? The man you once described as emotionally accessible as a vault inside a fortress on another planet? The very same. I described the Jade Horse and its history. Wow, Lauren said when I finished. That's significant, right? I tucked my feet under me, getting comfortable. It's not just the object itself, though it is beautiful. It's what it represents. An acknowledgement, maybe, of what he took from you. I considered this. Not just that. More like an acknowledgement that there's something to repair between us. That he wants to try. And do you? Her question was gentle but direct. After everything? It was the question I'd been asking myself on the drive home. The history between my father and me was complicated. Years of high expectations and perceived failures, of emotional distance and misunderstandings. There had been no dramatic rupture, no single unforgivable event, just a slow erosion of connection until we became little more than polite acquaintances who happened to share DNA. I think I do, I said finally. Not because I expect some miraculous transformation, but because I searched for the right words. Because I'm tired of the weight of what we aren't. And maybe there's a chance, however small, that we could be something better. That's very evolved of you, Lauren said, but there was warmth in her teasing. Don't give me too much credit. I'm still planning to take the job 3,000 miles away. She laughed. Baby steps. After we hung up, I made dinner, a simple pasta with vegetables, and opened a bottle of wine. As I ate, I found myself thinking about my father's hidden room, about the manuscript he'd spent 20 years tracking down. Patience. Years of it, he'd said. Perhaps that's what relationships required too. Patience and persistence. The willingness to keep searching even when the object seemed lost. The commitment to careful preservation once found. I took out my laptop and began researching flights to Kyoto for the following spring. Cherry blossom season was notoriously brief, and accommodations would need to be booked well in advance. On impulse, I looked at options for 2 rooms instead of 1. Maybe, I thought as I scrolled through possibilities, some collections were worth building together. The week passed in a blur of work and preparations for my mother's birthday celebration. We'd planned a small dinner at her favorite restaurant, just the 3 of us, as she'd requested. No fuss, she'd insisted, though I knew my father would ignore this and arrange for something special anyway. It was his way. Sunday arrived bright and clear, a perfect early autumn day with just enough crispness in the air to justify a light jacket. I wore a dress my mother had complimented before, deep blue with silver accents, and the silver earrings she'd given me for Christmas. As I parked outside the restaurant, I spotted my father's car already there, precisely on time, as always. I checked my watch. I was 7 minutes early, which meant he'd been even earlier. Some habits never changed. Inside, I found him at the bar, nursing what appeared to be sparkling water with lime. No Macallan tonight? I asked, sliding onto the stool beside him. He raised an eyebrow. Your mother prefers me sober for these occasions. A small smile played at the corner of his mouth. Apparently, I become overly sentimental with whiskey. Now that I'd like to see, I replied, trying to imagine my stoic father in a sentimental state. Perhaps someday? He signaled the bartender. What would you like? It's early yet. Your mother texted that she's running a few minutes behind. I ordered a glass of Riesling, and we sat in companionable silence for a moment. I looked into flights to Kyoto, I said finally, for cherry blossom season next year. He glanced at me, surprise evident in his expression. Did you? I nodded. Late March through early April is supposedly the peak time, though it varies year to year. That's correct. He took a sip of his water. The Japanese have a word for it, Sakura Zensen, the cherry blossom front. They track it like a weather pattern as it moves northward across the country. I was thinking, I said, my fingers tracing patterns in the condensation on my wine glass, that it might be nice to go. After I get settled at Westmore? I paused. If you and Mom were interested in joining. He was silent for a moment, and I worried I'd overstepped, moved too quickly from our tentative reconnection to something more substantial. I believe we would be, he said finally. Your mother has always wanted to see Japan, and as I mentioned, I have contacts there who could enhance the experience considerably. Good, I said, relief washing through me. It's just an idea at this point, but we could start planning. I'll research accommodations, he offered. There are several ryokan in Kyoto that provide an authentic experience while maintaining the comforts Western travelers expect. I smiled, recognizing his need to contribute, to organize. That would be helpful. His phone buzzed, and he glanced at it. Your mother is parking now. She says... He paused, looking vaguely embarrassed. She says to behave ourselves until she arrives. I laughed. She's always convinced we'll start arguing the moment she leaves the room. A not unreasonable fear, historically speaking, he acknowledged. True. But maybe less so now? He met my gaze, and I saw something thoughtful in his expression. Yes, he said. I believe so. We were still looking at each other, something unspoken but understood passing between us, when my mother swept into the restaurant in a flutter of silk scarf and perfume. My two favorite people, she exclaimed, embracing me first, then my father. And not a single tense expression between you. Is this my birthday miracle? Hello, Eleanor, my father said, his voice softening as it always did for her. You look lovely. She did, radiant in a deep green dress that complemented her auburn hair, which she refused to color despite the increasing strands of silver. The benefits of good genetics and expensive face cream, she replied with a wink. As we were escorted to our table, the best in the house, naturally, my father would have arranged for nothing less. I watched them together, noting the easy way they interacted despite having been divorced for over a decade. There was affection there, and respect, even if the romance had faded. I wondered, not for the first time, how they had managed to maintain that warmth through their separation, when they'd struggled to connect while together. Perhaps some relationships worked better with a certain amount of distance, allowing each person the space to be fully themselves. Now, my mother said once we were seated, I want to hear everything about your visit to your father's mausoleum. Of treasures. He's been suspiciously tight-lipped about it. My father gave her a look of mild exasperation. It's not a mausoleum, Eleanor. It's a specially designed preservation environment. Tomato, she said with a dismissive wave. Tell me everything, she repeated to me. So I did, describing the collection and the hidden room, the manuscript and the tea. I left out the jade horse, wanting to keep that private between my father and me, at least for now. And he didn't. Lecture you about the proper handling of archival materials even once? My mother asked, impressed. I didn't need to, my father said. She was appropriately careful. The simple compliment warmed me more than it probably should have. The waiter arrived with champagne, Dom Perignon, undoubtedly my father's selection, and we toasted my mother's health and happiness. And to new beginnings, she added, giving me a significant look. For all of us. I caught her meaning and raised my glass again. To new beginnings. My father joined the toast, his eyes meeting mine over the rim of his flute. There was something in his gaze, a question perhaps, or a promise. Whatever it was, I found myself willing to discover the answer. Dinner progressed with surprising ease. My mother, always the social linchpin in any gathering, kept conversation flowing with stories from her garden club, which apparently had transformed into something of a wine club over the past year, and updates on mutual acquaintances. As dessert arrived, a delicate chocolate soufflé with raspberry coulis, she turned the focus back to me. "So tell us more about this position at Westmore," she said, lifting a spoonful of the decadent confection. "When do you need to make your decision?" "End of next month," I replied. "They want me to visit the campus once more before then to meet with the full research team and discuss potential collaborations." "And you're leaning toward accepting?" my father asked. I nodded. It's a good fit academically, and the resources are exceptional. I hesitated, then added, "But it would mean leaving my position here, my apartment, my routines." "Change is always uncomfortable," my mother observed. "Even positive change. It's not just that." I traced the edge of my water glass with my finger. "I've been thinking about what I'd be leaving behind, what I might miss." My father was watching me carefully. "Such as?" I met his gaze directly. "Opportunities to build connections that might have been overlooked before." Something flickered in his eyes, understanding, perhaps, or appreciation for the subtle approach. "Modern technology makes distance less of an obstacle than it once was," he said, "and travel is always an option." "Kyoto in the spring," my mother interjected, looking between us curiously. "Yes," I agreed. "And perhaps other destinations as, well, Vienna," my father suggested, "for the symposium I mentioned." "I'd like that," I said, surprised by how much I meant it. My mother glanced between us, a pleased smile playing at her lips. "Well, isn't this lovely? My birthday wish came true after all." "What wish was that?" my father asked. "To see my two stubborn, brilliant, emotionally constipated loved ones finally having a civil conversation about something other than the weather or academic journals." I laughed, and after a moment, my father joined in. A rich, warm sound I'd almost forgotten existed. "We're hardly that bad," I protested. "Darling," my mother said, patting my hand, "you once spent an entire Thanksgiving dinner discussing barometric pressure rather than addressing the fact that you'd both read and passionately disagreed with the same obscure paper on neuroplasticity." My father cleared his throat. "In our defense, it was a particularly interesting weather pattern. And a spectacularly flawed study," I added. My mother rolled her eyes. "Case in point." As the waiter cleared our dessert plates, my father excused himself briefly. My mother immediately leaned forward. "Something's different," she said, her voice low and excited. "What happened during that visit? And don't tell me nothing. I know both of you too well." I hesitated, then reached into my purse and pulled out the jade horse, which I'd brought on impulse. "He gave me this." Her eyes widened as she recognized it. "Oh my," she breathed, taking it from me with gentle fingers. "I remember when he bought this for your birthday. He spent weeks researching the perfect piece. Something valuable, but not too delicate. Something that would grow with you, as he put it." "I don't remember that part," I said quietly. "No, you wouldn't. He did all that behind the scenes." She turned the small sculpture over, reading the inscription. "He was heartbroken when he took it back, you know. But he convinced himself it was for your own good, that he was teaching you responsibility." "That sounds like him." She nodded, returning the horse to me. "He's not an easy man to understand, your father. His own upbringing was structured, emotionally austere. Showing affection doesn't come naturally to him." "I know," I said, "but he's trying now, At least I think he is. He is, she confirmed. In his own way. She reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Be patient with him, and with yourself. I nodded, slipping the jade horse back into my purse as I saw my father returning to the table. Don't look so serious, you two, he said as he sat down. This is a celebration, after all. My mother's eyes sparkled with mischief. We were just discussing your charming habit of cataloging your socks by fiber content and country of origin. He gave her a look of dignified offense. I do no such thing. I organize them by color and weight, as any reasonable person would. I stifled a laugh, remembering the precisely arranged drawer I'd glimpsed in his dressing room years ago. Of course. Perfectly reasonable. He recognized the teasing and, to my surprise, played along. Efficiency is not a character flaw, despite what you both seem to believe. No, my mother agreed with exaggerated solemnity. It's a superpower, along with your uncanny ability to sense when a room is a quarter degree off your preferred temperature. Half a degree, he corrected, the corner of his mouth twitching upward. Quarter degrees are imperceptible even to me. We were all smiling then, sharing a moment of genuine warmth that felt both familiar and new. There had been times like this during my childhood. Brief, bright interludes when the three of us found a perfect equilibrium. They had been rare enough to stand out in my memory, precious stones among ordinary rocks. Perhaps, I thought as we continued our gentle banter through coffee and petit fours, they didn't have to be so rare anymore. After dinner, as we stood outside the restaurant saying our goodbyes, my father surprised me with a light touch on my arm. About lunch this week, he said. Would Wednesday work for you? The exhibition I mentioned opens that day. Wednesday would be perfect, I replied. What time? Noon? We could meet at the museum cafe. I'll be there. My mother watched this exchange with barely contained delight. When my father stepped away briefly to retrieve the valet ticket, she whispered, Whatever you did or said during that visit, thank you. I didn't do anything special, I protested. You showed up, she said simply. Sometimes that's enough. As I drove home later, the city lights blurring slightly through my windshield, I thought about her words. You showed up. It seemed too simple, too basic to have made any difference. And yet, perhaps that was exactly what had been missing all these years. The willingness to simply be present, to create space for something new to emerge. The jade horse sat on my passenger seat, a small green presence in the corner of my vision. I wondered what other treasures might be waiting to be discovered, not in my father's carefully curated collection, but in the unexplored territory between us. Wednesday arrived with unexpected nervousness on my part. I found myself changing outfits twice before settling on something suitably museum-appropriate yet casual, dark jeans, a silk blouse, and a tailored blazer. Professional but not stuffy. I wanted to look like myself, not a version curated for my father's approval. The museum was bustling when I arrived, a school group filing in ahead of me, their excited chatter echoing off the marble floors and high ceilings. I spotted my father immediately, standing slightly apart from the crowd, his tall figure impeccably dressed as always in a charcoal suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. Right on time, he observed as I approached, checking his watch briefly, a different one than he'd been wearing during our last meeting, I noticed. This one had a simpler face, though undoubtedly just as valuable. Punctuality is genetic, apparently, I replied with a small smile. He led the way to the cafe, where he'd already reserved a table by the window overlooking the sculpture garden. A waiter appeared almost immediately. My father had that effect on service staff, a combination of authority and the assumption of excellence that generally resulted in attentive treatment. The exhibition doesn't open to the public until 2, he explained after we'd ordered. But the curator is a former colleague. He's arranged a private viewing for us at 1. That's very kind of him, I said. impressed despite myself at my father's ability to arrange such things. What's the exhibition about? Medical illustrations from the Renaissance through the 19th century, he replied. Given your field, I thought it might interest you from both a historical and scientific perspective. I was touched by the thoughtfulness. It sounds fascinating. Thank you for thinking of it. He nodded, accepting my gratitude with characteristic reserve. How are your preparations for the Westmore visit progressing? Well enough. I've been reviewing their current research outputs to identify potential collaboration points. I paused. I've also been investigating housing options in the area, just to be prepared. Prudent, he approved. Have you considered university housing? Many institutions offer faculty accommodations at reduced rates. They do have some options, but I'm leaning toward finding my own place. After years in university settings, I'd like something that feels separate from work. He considered this. Reasonable. Though security should be a priority. Perhaps a managed apartment building with controlled access. I suppressed a smile at his practical concerns. I'll keep that in mind. Our lunch arrived. A niçoise salad for him, pesto linguine for me, and we ate in companionable silence for a few minutes. I've been thinking about our conversation regarding travel, he said eventually, setting down his fork with precise movements. About Kyoto, specifically. Oh? I tried to keep my tone neutral, unsure where he was going with this. I spoke with my contact there, Hayashi Takahiro. He's a curator at the National Museum and an old acquaintance. He mentioned that a private collection of Edo period artifacts will be available for viewing during the cherry blossom season. Normally, these pieces are not accessible to the public. That sounds like a remarkable opportunity, I said carefully. Indeed. He took a sip of water. Hayashi also suggested several ryokan that might be suitable. I've compiled information. He withdrew a slim folder from his briefcase and handed it to me. Inside were printouts of 3 traditional Japanese inns, each more beautiful than the last, along with notes on their amenities, histories, and proximity to both cherry blossom viewing sites and cultural attractions. This is thorough, I said, genuinely impressed by the effort. Merely preliminary research, he replied, though I could tell he was pleased by my reaction. Your mother would need to review the options as well, of course. Of course, I closed the folder. Thank you for doing this. He made a dismissive gesture as if to suggest it was nothing, though we both knew it wasn't.